I love sci-fi. Yeah, me. You may also know that I love creating large-scale atmospheric environments. But whenever I go to my portfolio and look at all the art I've made, specifically this one, which I made 3 years ago, and now looking back at it, I hate it. It was pretty much a failed attempt at recreating a sci-fi post-apocalyptic environment. I mean, just look at these things. And now, after 3 years of gathering more experience in this field, I want to recreate it using inspiration from these amazing movies that have wonderful cinematic large-scale shots and turn my old artwork into this, while sharing my workflow and a breakdown with you guys. Now that the YouTuber intro is done, let's get into it. I put down a plane and scaled it up to exactly how long I want it to be. Then I put the camera exactly where I want it to be, changed the clip end, subdivide the plane quite a few times, and then start sculpting. Now, while you're sculpting, try to keep going back to the main camera so that you kind of have an angle of what you're exactly doing, because sometimes you can just sculpt and then kind of just lose track of what it looks like in the camera, and then you come back to the camera and you're like, what did I even create? Then you get a basic HDRI, basically from anywhere. Then I get a grass texture from Megascans, and you'll notice when I apply it to the landscape, it's way too shiny. That's because the specular is way too high. So turn on the specular quite a lot. Generally, I try to keep it between 0.1 to 0.2. Then I jump into World Creator and create this mountain scale. Now don't worry, you can get access to this for free on my Patreon. Just go to it, sign up as a free member, and you'll see a post about it. I love to use World Creator for this sort of stuff because it just gives amazing results, and you can even try it for free if I'm correct. You won't be able to export stuff out of it, but you can just experiment with it if you want to. Also, speaking of my Patreon, if you guys are interested in getting the whole source file of the projects that I create, including all of the assets and early access videos, I post all of them on my Patreon. So if you're interested in that, I would recommend checking it out. Anyways, after I export it, I just use the World Creator plugin to one-click import it. But you'll notice that the textures are messed up, and you just gotta fix it by importing the color map and the normal map data separately and then just plugging it into the channels, and that fixes it. Now I want the mountains to feel like they are huge and they come from outside of the frame, and then both of them meet at the center, which kind of also guides the viewer's eyes and helps with the composition because the center will be the ship. Then I move on to creating cloud shadows for the large landscape, because for something this size, that is a must. For that, you can go into the texture and put a noise texture down, then put a color ramp down and squeeze the two nodes together to increase the contrast. And there you go. Now you have fake simulated cloud shadows. You can also change the texture to 4D, which will also give you this extra W value, which you can play around with. It basically changes the rotation and location. It's kind of like merges things together and creates different kinds of holes. You can also play around with the scale, depending on how large your scene is. Then I change my texture from object to world output. That basically allows me to control my HDRI. Here I just play around with the Z axis on the rotation. It allows me to just change the location of the sun, and I just experiment until I find something I'm happy with. Then I also add a sun to increase the brightness of the HDRI because it wasn't bright enough for my liking. Then I move on to the atmosphere of the scene. Now this will make or break my scene because fog is carrying my scene here. For that, put in a cube down that is big enough that it encompasses your whole scene. Now I want the fog to come up till the halfway point and then start to fall off and not be as intense, so it covers up most of the tops of the mountains. And for that, we're going to use a gradient texture. Now you'll already see when I visualize it, it goes from black to white. Now you can change its rotation and location to change exactly where the fog starts and falls off on the cube, and for that I'll put in a color ramp to change the contrast better, and I'll visualize by going inside of the cube and then lining it up to exactly in relation to the mountains where I wanted to start falling off. Then you can plug that into the density of a volume scatter, and there you go. Now you have a fog that falls off exactly where you want it to be, and you can control how the fall off goes. You can make it super soft or super harsh. You'll also notice the fog just looks weird. That is because our light bounces for our volume are 0. That is default in Blender, so I would recommend you change it to at least 4, and that already makes a huge difference. But that's because now the light is actually bouncing around inside of the volume, illuminating other particles that are around it, which makes the fog actually act like real fog. After I'm done with that, I'm still not happy with the atmosphere, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a principled volume shader. And using an add shader, I'm going to mix these two shaders together. Now the density at start is way too high, I would recommend taking a light path node and a math node, changing it to multiply, plugging is camera ray into one of the values, plugging that into the density. Now you can control the density through that value slider. And I'm gonna put it to something moderately low because in a huge scene, that already makes a lot of difference. Now we have two different nodes that do two completely different things inside of one simple mesh. And now our volume is complete. Now I'm going to show you how I did this real-time displacement texture where as I paint, the landscape automatically displaces itself. Bring in a basic mud path texture that you want your path to have and mix the two shaders together, the grass and the mud, using a mix shader. After that, create a new image texture that you're going to use as the factor to blend them together. And I go with a 4K size because 2K is a little too low resolution for such a size of the landscape. Then go to Eevee because you can see real time. Then choose a displacement texture, create a completely new texture for this, and assign the untitled texture, which is what is named for me, to the landscape. Now, in Eevee, if you try to paint, you'll see that you get your path exactly where you're painting. But it's not displaced. That's because the coordinates are not set to UV. Make sure to do that. And now, you can just fiddle around with the strength to get this real-time displacement. It looks a little too jagged. To fix that, you can just add a subdivision modifier and it'll smooth that out. And there you have your real-time displacement. So now using this great shader that we just created, I paint out the whole path starting from in front of the camera till the end of the landscape. And in the end, you can see how that displacement texture makes a lot of difference in the scene. Then I hop onto Polyhaven to get their first sapling pack. This is honestly insane. I did not know because this is my first time using Polyhaven, but their trees are completely procedural. That's game changing. It's all made from geometry nodes. You can completely customize the length, shape, density of the branches, everything about these trees. I guess the one downside is they can be a little too heavy for a weak computer, so I would recommend you turn them into a mesh and then decimate them if you're using a weaker computer. So I bring two different variations of the tree inside our main scene here. Then I use geoscatter while using an image mask and paint out the areas where I want the trees to grow out of. I'm using the same philosophy that I used with the mountains. I want the trees to come out from the edges of the frame and then meet in the center, acting as leading lines for the main ship. I go into sculpt mode as I was not exactly happy with the landscape's formation and the trees scattered on top of it looked a little strange because it was too uniform. So I sculpt out different variations onto the landscape so the trees have a different rotation. After a lot of tweaking, I am much happier with how the scene is looking. Then I go back into Polyhaven to get a grass asset pack from there. The grass is pretty well optimized. It has these planes in the middle with textures projected on them which make the grass look fuller than they actually are. Then I bring it back into the main project file. Then using geoscatter, I scatter it. I use the road texture that we created as a culling mask so that the grass does not spawn there, and just using all the settings that geoscatter provides to scatter it. For example, using a noise mask in the grow to grow certain areas more than others. One tip I could give you guys about trees is when there's a large chunk of trees grouped up together, usually at the fall off where they stop, the trees are much smaller than the trees in the center, which are much bigger. So I would recommend using a mask and just shrinking the trees at the edge. Makes it look much more natural. Now I've been the main star of the show, the ship. I bring it into the main scene and just try to match the location how it was in the original artwork. I'm not gonna make any changes to the ship model. I'm pretty happy with how it looked. I'm pretty pleased with how the 3 year ago me modeled this ship. I can see a lot of issues with it now, but if I have to make fundamental changes to the ship model, I'll probably have to make the entire ship model again, which I don't want to do. So we're going to use it how it is. And I mean, it still holds up. Then I jump back into Polyhaven to get a pine tree model. I'm still very surprised with how high quality the assets are. I import one of the main trees that looked the best into the main scene. That's going to be the main foreground asset, and for the background I just reused the fir trees that I had that I scattered all around. Then I decided to throw in a light blocker into the scene. I always do that for most of my scenes as it just creates a more dynamic atmosphere and lets the viewer's eye go towards the midground instead of the foreground. Now let me show you guys how I did this pretty sweet snow texture that you can just paint on and it just blends so amazingly. So just take a new mix shader node, bring in a principled BSDF and bring in your snow texture. After that, just do the same process, create a new image texture, plug it into the factor, then use the displacement texture of the grass and plug it into a new color ramp. Then using a mix color node, add these two shaders together and change the mix mode to color burn and put the factor completely to 1. Then if you paint, you'll see you just get a white blob. Why? Because you still haven't really messed around with the color ramp contrast. So just put up those curves, and when you visualize it again, you see that the snow is kind of blending in, but it looks weird. It doesn't look realistic, it doesn't look pleasing. So one thing you can do is separate the mapping node that you have for the displacement texture and make it just completely custom for that specific one, and just play around with that. I recommend a much higher scale for it, it just looks kind of better, and just completely flip the color ramp. And just doing that makes a huge difference. Flipping the color ramp completely changes the game, and you can see it looks much smoother now. Now I bring in a custom brush. You can get one from Megascans, and using that I just paint in snow into the areas where it realistically makes sense, where like the trees would block the sunlight from getting in. Now the scene is starting to come together. Then I go back into the grass scatter, make a completely new mask, and mask out the new areas where the snow is so it doesn't look too green. I also wanted to create a new grass type which is half covered in snow. For that, it's pretty simple. You go into the grass shader, duplicate the shader, then get a noise texture, mix those two together, and as the factor, keep the noise texture there, get in a color ramp, increase the contrast between the two, bump up the scale, and you basically already have snow. Now it's just about playing with the contrast to get the result you like. Then I create a new scatter layer for the snow grass and put it exactly where the snow mask is, making the scatter look much more realistic. Now making some large light blockers that block lights coming onto the mountains. I don't want the mountains to be too bright or take up too much of the viewer's attention. So I just put the alpha of those planes to like maybe 0.5, so there's some light still breaking through, just not as much. I also create a new light that I want to be parented to the ship, because I want the viewer's eye to be completely onto the ship this time, because the rest of the scene is pretty dark, and having a brighter light to create a better contrast on the ship would just make it look much better. If you don't want the light to be affecting anything but the ship, you can use light linking. Basically, put your ship into a completely new collection, name that collection ship, then go into the properties of your light and go to light linking, choose the exact collection that you just created, just search ship, and boom, now the ship is the only thing that is affected by that light. But I also want some light onto the environment and the atmosphere. What I'll do is I'll duplicate this light and then remove that collection from that light. Now the light also affects the environment, but it's not too bright that it also completely ruins the realism of the scene, as you can just turn down the strength of that light. Then I go into Sketchfab to get a new spaceship. I really did not like whatever the big cylinders that I put into the previous artwork. They just kind of looked weird, not realistic at all. This time I wanted this spaceship which fit the scene perfectly in my mind. So I just bring the ship in and just kind of line it up exactly where I want it for now. It still has the base texture that it came with. I'm gonna put rust onto that texture and also do some destruction onto the ships. Now I want to put some rust onto the ships because a brand new paint job is not gonna cut it. So I get the Blenderesse nodes that I use for every single one of my videos almost. They're just procedurally based mask nodes that take ambient occlusion and bevel into account, and they have a lot of values in them that you can play around with. They're completely free, so I'm just gonna link Blenderesse's Gumroad onto the description. Then I bring in the second node, which is the bevel node. The first one was the ambient occlusion node. I'm going to use mix color to mix both of these together with the main texture of the ship. You can use both of these as a factor. And for the main color, now you can just select all of these nodes, press Ctrl G to just make a group out of them, name it rust, and now you can just copy it and go into every single one of the textures and just place this. You don't have to do anything else. You can just go and place it in every single one of the textures and it just applies rust. Now we move on to the destruction of the ship. For that, make a big cube and align it exactly where you want a small part to break off from the main ship's hull. Then take the ship, get a boolean modifier, use the cube as the boolean, and you'll already see that it cuts into the ship. Now duplicate the ship and change the duplicates boolean mode to intersect, which will give you a separate piece that should break off. Now you have the ship and the main hull separated. Now you can just place it in a realistic way where you can see it falling off onto the mountain. Then you can just go into the main ship and just make some edits, put in some random wires and just metal bits coming out so that it just doesn't look completely hollow on the inside and just makes it look like there's just stuff happening, even if it's not a lot. When we move on to the second ship, you'll see that the changes carried over because we used Alt-D to create an instance of the mesh. So the changes carry over to both of them. Then I just duplicate the bit that broke off and also just place it in a realistic way. You can also play around with one of the wings, for example. You can just separate it and just make it look like it kind of also broke from the impact and it just kind of got separated. Also just model some basic cubes and just make them stick out of the ship just to sell the whole destruction effect. Even though it doesn't make sense or doesn't look realistic, in the fog it's not gonna be apparent. Now the scene is really coming together. Now I go to Grasswald. They also have a free, huge library of really high quality assets, and I get these dead kind of weed branches that I'm gonna scatter, create a new separate layer, and just mask out areas where I want these to grow out of, and that just also helps creating a better foliage on the foreground. I'll also just show you quickly how I did the ship animation. It's mostly reliant on these modifiers in the graph editor. I gave the ship an animation from point A to point B, that's it, just a location. And then you can go in the graph editor and select each individual nodes like the Y rotation, X rotation, and apply these noise modifiers to them. First, when you apply it, you obviously see that the scale and strength is very weird and the ship just looks like it's jittering. That's not what we need. So you turn up the scale to pretty high, so it looks like the ship is just wobbling around a little because it's kind of old and one of the fans is not as fast as the other, so it just creates this natural wobble in its movement. And now you can just play around with the strength and the scale. Then you can just copy it and paste it into the X rotation. That just creates a wobble forward and backward instead from left to right. I'll also give you a basic breakdown of how I did the moving wires. Basically create some curves, align them to where you want the wires to be. So just at the end point, at the start point. You do the same with the rest. So we have 3 wires. After you're done with that, turn them into a mesh. So you can go convert to and mesh. After it's converted to mesh, you can select them. You'll see that all of them have been converted into vertices, so it's a real mesh. Now you can just apply a skin modifier to them. After applying the skin modifier, go into edit mode and click mark root, and then you can control A to scale them to an appropriate size. You'll still notice that they're very cube-like in their appearance, and the way you solve that is you can click smooth shading. That'll help, but they're still cubes after all, so the way you can fix it properly is adding a subdivision surface modifier, and that'll just add more geometry and smooth it out to make them look like real wires. Now, how do you actually animate them and make them move around realistically how wires would? For that, you can go back into edit mode, turn off the skin modifier so you can actually see the mesh, then select each individual end and start point of each one of the wires. After you've done that, just add them as a vertex group and click assign. Now we can use them as a pin group because we're gonna do a cloth modifier. I quickly just parent them to the main ship so it actually goes on with the ship as the ship is animated. Then just add the cloth modifier. Go into the shape and select pin group while selecting the mesh and add the vertex group. Now when you animate it, it'll still look weird because it's still not baked. But before we bake, I would also recommend you add turbulence force inside of the scene. That'll just give your mesh a bit of a wavy movement, and also make sure that the cloth modifier is on top of everything and then the skin and then the subdiv, otherwise it might mess up your simulation. And after we do that, just hit bake. And we get a very pleasing result. Moving on to the rotating blades of the scene, just select both of them, press P to separate them from the mesh, and then rotate them into their own axis. Do the same for the main thing below the engine to just give a little bit more movement. I also want these flappy bits that are hanging out to be also just moving around with the movement of the ship, so I just separate them, then I place the cursor on the top edge and change the origin to that cursor. Now you can just independently move it around exactly from that point. So I just put in a keyframe to that specific thing, just one keyframe, and now you can go into its Y rotation and just paste in your noise. Now you can just play around with its scale and strength, then you can do the same for the other bit that is hanging out. And now it just wobbles around, look at that. Then you can also just select and separate this little thing. I really like it because it just adds a lot to the shape of the ship. You can do the same thing with that. You can just separate it and then add its origin to the bottom. Then you can just give it a basic keyframe and then add the noise modifiers to it as well. And after doing all of that, the ship is actually moving dynamically. I also love Red Dead Redemption 2, specifically this lavender field area. So I wanted to recreate parts of this lavender field inside of my scene. So I jumped onto Grasswald to find something that really fit that purple flower look, and I found these. So I bring them in and start scattering them. I start to scatter them in patches, and that's how they look. So I just try to polish up the scattering a bit more, and now I was more happy with how it was looking. I also wanted the same sign that I had in my old artwork in this one as well. I just really like the way it looks. So I bring in a noise texture, add some rust to it with the mix color node. That just adds a bit more realism to it, because in the previous one it just looked brand new, which was kind of weird. I also wanted a fence, which was also gonna act as like a guiding point for the composition, but I tried these ones and they just looked pretty ugly. I tried a few and I hated most of them, but this one just really stuck out to me. It just felt perfect in the scene. So with everything in and adding some extra bushes, I was really liking how it was coming along by the end. But before we render the final scene, I go into the Blender compositor. Here I don't do too much, but I do my usual thing of adding a glare node, switching that to fog glow, switching the quality to high, and you can also change the mix factor. If you go into the negatives, that'll reduce the amount of fog glow. Also play with the threshold. The lower the threshold, the more glow you'll have around the scene. So I try to find a sweet point of 0.1. I really like how it adds just a little subtle glow on the top, so I keep it at that. You can see it just adds a small glow. Then I'm also going to add a lens distortion node. This one, I'll do a little bit of distortion, just like -0.1 to -0.2. Also check off the fill box and just do a little bit of dispersion. That just adds a little bit of chromatic aberration to the edges of the scene. And with all of that done, I'm just going to take it into DaVinci Resolve, and here's the final scene. Thanks for watching the breakdown, especially if you made it till the end. I would also be really interested in hearing your thoughts on it. And see you in the next video.